is, you're a loser, Owen Hart. Not because I say you are, but because it runs through your veins.
From Stone Cold Steve Austin, to The Rock, to Shawn Michaels, to even his own brother Bret, Owen Hart made enemies everywhere he went. In this video, we're breaking down the wrestlers who believed Owen went too far and, in their own words, felt he ultimately deserved what happened to him. Starting with Bret Hart. When we talk about intense relationships in Owen Hart's life, there is absolutely no way we can begin anywhere other than with his older brother, Bret the Hitman Hart. The rivalry between these two brothers was one of the most compelling storylines in professional wrestling history, primarily because it was rooted in something that was painfully, undeniably real. As documented extensively by the Sportster, the relationship between Bret and Owen Hart was far more complicated than most fans ever realized while watching their battles unfold on Monday Night Raw and various pay-per-view events. You see, Owen Hart spent years living in the enormous shadow cast by his older brother's unprecedented success. While Bret was capturing championship after championship and being positioned as the face of the entire World Wrestling Federation, Owen was often relegated to the mid-card, watching from the sidelines as opportunities seemingly passed him by. This wasn't merely a storyline crafted by creative writers. This was a genuine sibling rivalry that had been festering since their childhood in the Hart family home. According to Bleacher Report, Owen genuinely felt overshadowed and harbored authentic jealousy toward Bret's accomplishments, emotions that added genuine intensity to their on-screen confrontations. What makes this situation even more fascinating is that Bret himself has publicly acknowledged that it was actually his idea to channel Owen's real-life frustrations into the famous brother versus brother storyline that captivated audiences throughout 1993 to 1995. Bret recognized that his younger brother was genuinely frustrated with his positioning in the company, and rather than letting that frustration boil over in destructive ways, he suggested they use it to create something memorable. The result was one of the most emotionally resonant feuds in wrestling history, culminating in their legendary match at WrestleMania X. Despite the real underlying tensions that existed between them, it's important to note that Bret and Owen maintained a close bond throughout their lives. The frustrations were real, the jealousy was genuine, and the backstage strain was documented, but at the end of the day, they were brothers who loved each other deeply. Their story serves as a reminder that even the closest family relationships can be complicated by professional rivalry and the pursuit of success in an incredibly competitive industry. Speaking of complicated relationships that were forged through in-ring incidents, perhaps no wrestler had more legitimate reason to hold a grudge against Owen Hart than our next legend on this list, a man whose career and health were forever altered by a single botched maneuver. Steve Austin. If there was ever a case of genuine, lasting animosity that existed between Owen Hart and another wrestler, the situation involving Stone Cold Steve Austin stands as perhaps the most documented and well-known example in professional wrestling history. What happened between these two men went far beyond any storyline or scripted rivalry. This was a real-life incident that caused permanent physical damage and created a rift that was never properly mended before Owen's tragic passing in 1999. The incident in question occurred at SummerSlam 1997 during what should have been a routine Intercontinental Championship match between the two competitors. Owen Hart attempted to execute a sit-out tombstone piledriver on Austin, but something went horribly wrong. The move was botched, and Steve Austin's head and neck took the full impact in a way that was never intended. The result was a fractured neck that caused temporary paralysis and long-term physical issues that would plague Austin for the remainder of his career and beyond. The footage from that night remains difficult to watch even today. Austin lay motionless in the ring, unable to move, while Owen and the referee tried to figure out what to do next. In a moment that demonstrated Austin's incredible toughness, he somehow managed to roll Owen up for the pinfall victory despite being unable to feel his extremities. But the damage had been done, and the aftermath of that night would define the relationship between these two men forever.
The bottom line is, you're a loser, Owen Hart. Not because I say you are, but because it runs through your veins.
What made the situation particularly unforgivable in Austin's eyes was what happened, or rather what didn't happen, after the incident. According to reports from Ringside News, Owen Hart never apologized to Austin or reached out to check on his well-being, despite receiving advice from others that he should do so. This lack of communication was something Austin found absolutely unforgivable, and it destroyed any trust that had existed between the two performers. Jim Ross himself has spoken about how Austin Austin held a long-standing grudge against Owen Hart following the incident. The Texas Rattlesnake reportedly refused to work with Owen again, and while Austin has clarified that he didn't outright hate Owen, the real backstage heat between them was undeniable. It's a tragic footnote to both men's careers that this rift was never resolved before Owen's untimely death. The fallout from this incident extended beyond just Austin's physical well-being. It affected how Owen was perceived by some of his peers and added another layer of tension to an already tumultuous period in WWF history. Speaking of tumultuous periods, the months surrounding and following the infamous Montreal Screwjob created another intense conflict in Owen's career, this time involving a man who was at the very center of that controversial event: Shawn Michaels. The Montreal Screwjob remains one of the most controversial and discussed moments in professional wrestling history. On November 9, 1997, at the Survivor Series pay-per-view event, Vince McMahon orchestrated a finish to the WWF Championship match between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels that Bret had not agreed to, effectively screwing the Hitman out of the title on his way out of the company. The ramifications of that single night rippled throughout the entire wrestling industry, and perhaps no one felt the aftershocks more intensely than Owen Hart. As documented by The Ringer in their extensive coverage of the Montreal Screwjob, the Hart family's hatred toward those involved in the incident was very real and very intense. Owen, being Bret's loyal younger brother, harbored deep anger toward Shawn Michaels for his role in betraying the Hart family. In Owen's eyes, Michaels had been complicit in one of the greatest acts of treachery the business had ever seen, and that was something he could not easily forgive or forget. The tension between Owen and Shawn Michaels became so palpable that it actually derailed planned storylines. According to multiple sources, including Wikipedia's documentation of this period, Michaels reportedly refused to participate in a planned feud with Owen Hart following the Screwjob. The reason? Michaels was genuinely afraid that Owen might shoot on him, wrestling terminology meaning to wrestle for real with the intent to actually hurt your opponent rather than cooperate to create the illusion of combat. This fear was not entirely unfounded. Owen's loyalty to his brother was legendary, and the rage he felt toward those who had wronged Bret was no secret backstage. Whether Michaels' concerns were justified or simply a convenient excuse to avoid working with someone from the Hart family remains a matter of debate among wrestling historians. What is certain is that this situation directly derailed Owen's planned Blackheart push, a darker character direction that could have elevated Owen to new heights in the company. The genuine backstage tension between Owen and Shawn Michaels was emblematic of the larger conflict that existed between the Hart family and Michaels' notorious backstage faction known as the Clique. This group of friends, which also included Triple H, wielded enormous influence behind the scenes, and their ongoing rivalry with the Hart family created countless moments of friction during this era. Speaking of the Clique and their conflicts with Owen Hart, one member in particular seemed to take special delight in antagonizing the youngest Hart brother: Triple H. Triple H, born Paul Levesque, was a central figure in the Clique, and later the even more influential faction known as D-Generation X. As a key player in the backstage politics that defined the WWF during the late 1990s, Triple H found himself directly opposed to the Hart family on multiple occasions. His conflicts with Owen Hart were particularly notable for how they blended on-screen antagonism with very real behind-the-scenes tension. Perhaps no moment better encapsulated the disdain that DX held for Owen Hart than when Triple H and his cohorts began referring to Owen as a nugget. This wasn't just a playful nickname. In wrestling parlance, calling someone a nugget was essentially calling them worthless, insignificant, someone who didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. For a talented performer like Owen, who had spent years proving himself as one of the best technical wrestlers in the world, this was a deliberate insult designed to undermine and demean him.
Owen Hart, the last remnants of something that used to be.
Bret Hart himself has spoken about how Triple H tarred and feathered Owen during this period. The Game and his DX allies used their considerable influence and television time to mock Owen relentlessly. And while some of this was part of scripted storylines, the underlying animosity was very real. The Clique's disdain for the Hart family extended to Owen, and he felt the full weight of their backstage politicking. The aftermath of the Montreal Screwjob only intensified these tensions. As part of DX, Triple Triple H was aligned with Shawn Michaels, the man at the center of the controversy that had torn the Hart family apart. Owen, trapped in the WWF due to contractual obligations while his brother had been essentially forced out of the company, had to endure working in an environment where his family's enemies held significant power. It was a difficult and frustrating period for Owen, and the tensions with Triple H and DX were a constant source of backstage friction. The DX parodies of Owen and the Hart family were meant to entertain audiences, but they also served as a vehicle for real-life animosity. Triple H and his allies were sending a message about where the power lay in the WWF, and Owen was often on the receiving end of that message. While the two eventually had to work together professionally, the underlying tension never fully dissipated. But Triple H and DX weren't the only ones who took shots at Owen during his career. Years before the Screwjob and the Attitude Era, another legendary performer had his own heated issues with the youngest Hart brother, Jerry Lawler, Jerry the King. Lawler is one of the most recognizable figures in professional wrestling history. As the undisputed king of Memphis wrestling and the USWA, Lawler built a legendary career that eventually led him to the WWF, where he became famous as a color commentator alongside Jim Ross. But before those commentary days, Lawler was still an active competitor, and his conflicts with the Hart family, including Owen, were the stuff of wrestling legend. The rivalry between Jerry Lawler and the Hart family was rooted in the territorial nature of professional wrestling during that era. As documented by Place to Be Nation, Lawler viewed the Harts, including Owen, as WWF invaders encroaching on his Memphis territory. This territorial mentality was common among wrestlers of Lawler's generation, and it created genuine friction between him and the Canadian wrestling dynasty. During their 1993 USWA feud, Lawler's promos against Owen were filled with genuine intensity that went beyond typical wrestling theatrics. Lawler viewed Owen as a punk interloper, someone who was riding on his brother's coattails while invading Lawler's home territory. The heated promos and threats weren't entirely scripted. There was real frustration behind the words, born from Lawler's sense that his kingdom was under siege.
In the meantime, I got somebody I'm gonna take care of, and that is your punk brother, Owen Hart.
The WWF versus USWA war of that era provided the backdrop for these intense confrontations. Lawler expressed backstage frustration over the Hart family's involvement in his territory, and Owen, as Bret's brother and a representative of the WWF during their crossover shows, bore the brunt of some of that frustration. The King feud buildup between them blended kayfabe storylines with genuine territorial intensity. While Lawler and Owen eventually worked together professionally without major incident, those early conflicts demonstrated the complicated dynamics that existed when different wrestling worlds collided. The territorial system was dying by the mid-1990s, but its influence lingered in the attitudes of performers like Lawler, who had built their careers defending their home promotions. Owen, caught between worlds as both a Hart family member and an individual performer trying to make his own name, often found himself navigating these complex political waters. And speaking of complicated relationships involving family and professional wrestling, few situations were as tangled as Owen's partnership with his own brother-in-law. British Bulldog. The British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith, was more than just a colleague to Owen Hart. He was family. Married to Owen's sister Diana Hart, Bulldog and Owen shared both a bloodline and a professional partnership that would see them become one of the most decorated tag teams of the 1990s. But as anyone who has ever worked closely with family members knows, those relationships can be both a blessing and a tremendous source of conflict. As documented by wrestling historians, the tag team partnership between Owen Hart and the British Bulldog during their 1996 to 1997 championship run was marked by both tremendous success and real underlying tensions. The dissension storylines that played out on television weren't entirely fabricated. They mirrored actual miscommunications and ego clashes that occurred between the two brothers-in-law behind the scenes. The situation became particularly tense when Bulldog won the European Championship, sparking genuine competition between the two partners. While tag team partners are supposed to support each other's success, the reality of professional wrestling is that everyone is ultimately fighting for their own spot, their own push, their own moment in the spotlight. According to multiple accounts, the situation required Bret Hart himself to intervene in some of their matches and backstage discussions to keep the peace between his brother and his brother-in-law. The family dynamic made everything more complicated. When you're having professional disagreements with a colleague, you can potentially avoid them outside of work. But when that colleague is married to your sister, when they're the father of your nieces and nephews, when they'll be sitting across from you at Christmas dinner, the stakes of every conflict become much higher. Owen and Bulldog had to navigate not just their professional relationship, but also their family obligations, and that created a unique kind of pressure. Despite these tensions, Owen and Bulldog managed to remain one of the most successful tag teams of their era, capturing championship gold and delivering memorable matches. But the underlying ego clashes and miscommunications were real, adding another layer of complexity to Owen's already complicated professional life. Their story serves as a reminder that mixing family and business, especially in an industry as competitive as professional wrestling, is never simple. But while family tensions could be mediated and eventually resolved, some of Owen's professional conflicts were far more physically intense, as we'll see with his next rival. Ken Shamrock. Ken Shamrock came to the World Wrestling Federation with a legitimate fighting background that few could match. As a former UFC Superfight champion and one of the pioneers of mixed martial arts, Shamrock brought a level of real combat credibility to professional wrestling that added an element of danger to every match he participated in. When his path crossed with Owen Hart's, the resulting feud would push both men to their physical limits. The rivalry between Owen Hart and Ken Shamrock in 1998 was notable for its intense physicality. Their matches, which included specialty stipulations like the Dungeon match and the legendary Lion's Den match, were documented as pushing the boundaries of what was typically seen in WWF programming. These weren't your standard wrestling contests. They were brutal, hard-hitting affairs that blurred the line between worked entertainment and legitimate combat. Owen's attacks during this feud were particularly vicious, targeting Shamrock's ankle repeatedly, and even incorporating moments like biting Shamrock's ear during their fully loaded 1998 encounter. While professional wrestling is scripted, the physical toll these matches took on both performers was very real. Shamrock, with his background in legitimate fighting, developed a genuine wariness about working with Owen due to the injury risks involved in their hard-hitting style. It's important to note that this wariness was mixed with mutual respect. Shamrock has spoken about his matches with Owen as career highlights, acknowledging the artistry involved in creating such compelling and believable combat. But the physical nature of their work together created a tension that existed alongside that respect, a recognition that every time they stepped into the ring together, there was a genuine risk that someone could get hurt. The Shamrock-Owen feud demonstrated Owen's versatility as a performer. He could work the technical mat-based style that the Hart family was famous for, but he could also adapt to the more physical, MMA-influenced approach that Shamrock brought to the table. It was this adaptability that made Owen such a valuable performer, even as it sometimes led him into physically dangerous situations. But while Owen's issues with Shamrock were born from professional intensity, some of his backstage conflicts had roots that went back much further, to the days before he ever set foot in a WWF ring. Bad News Allen. Bad News Allen, also known as Bad News Brown, was a legitimate tough guy in every sense of the word. Before his professional wrestling career, Allen had won a bronze medal in judo at the 1976 Montreal Olympics. He was a man who commanded respect through his genuine fighting abilities, and he expected that respect to be shown by everyone he worked with, especially younger wrestlers who were still learning the business. Owen Hart's issues with Bad News Allen dated back to their time together in Stampede Wrestling, the Calgary-based promotion run by Owen's father, Stu Hart. As documented in various shoot interviews and wrestling histories, the heat between Owen and Bad News Allen was rooted in an incident involving a disputed match finish. According to the accounts, Owen pinned Bad News Allen in a match when that wasn't the planned outcome, defying the agreed-upon finish and making Allen look bad in the process. For a veteran like Bad News Allen, this was an unforgivable breach of professional wrestling protocol. The business operated on trust. Wrestlers had to trust that their opponents would follow the planned finishes and protect each other in the ring. When Owen deviated from the plan, he violated that trust in a way that Allen could not overlook. The result was a backstage confrontation where Bad News Allen reportedly assaulted Owen and threatened to take him out for real. Allen viewed Owen's actions as disrespectful to veterans who had paid their dues in the business. In the old-school wrestling mentality that Allen embodied, younger wrestlers were supposed to follow the lead of more experienced performers, not improvise finishes that made the veterans look foolish. The fact that Owen was a Hart, the son of the promoter, likely added to Allen's frustration, as it may have appeared that Owen felt entitled to do whatever he wanted without consequences. This incident served as an early lesson for Owen about the politics and unwritten rules of professional wrestling. While Owen would go on to have a legendary career, the heat Heat with Bad News Allen was a reminder that the wrestling business had a hierarchy, and violating that hierarchy, especially against a legitimate tough guy like Allen, could have serious consequences. Speaking of old school wrestlers who believed in enforcing respect, few were more feared in the locker room than our next subject. Harley Race. Harley Race is widely regarded as one of the toughest men to ever participate in professional wrestling. An 8-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion, Race was a throwback to an era when wrestlers were expected to be able to legitimately defend themselves, and he carried that old-school mentality with him throughout his career. Race was known for demanding respect from younger wrestlers, and he had very particular views about how that respect should be shown. Owen Hart was legendary for his pranks. He was widely considered the greatest ribber in wrestling history, with countless stories about his elaborate practical jokes that kept locker rooms entertained for years. But when Owen decided to target Harley Race with one of his pranks, he learned that some veterans don't appreciate having their food tampered with. According to multiple accounts documented by the Sportster, Owen once spiked Harley Race's chili with hot sauce as a prank. While this might seem like harmless fun in most contexts, Race viewed it as a major insult, a sign of disrespect from a younger wrestler who hadn't earned the right to pull such pranks on a legend of his stature. In Race's old-school worldview, there were boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, and messing with a veteran's food was definitely one of them. Race's retaliation was swift and memorable. As documented in various backstage stories, Race responded to Owen's prank by tasering him. This wasn't a gentle warning or a stern talking to. Race physically retaliated in a way that sent a clear message about respecting your elders in the wrestling business. The incident created genuine backstage animosity and served as a reminder that while Owen's pranks were usually received with good humor, targeting the wrong person could have serious consequences. The Race incident became legendary in wrestling circles, often cited as an example of old-school wrestling enforcing the locker room hierarchy. Owen, for all his talents and popularity, had to learn that certain veterans weren't to be trifled with. It's a story that captures both Owen's mischievous personality and the harsh realities of the wrestling business during that era. And speaking of learning hard lessons about the wrestling business, our final entry involves a conflict that was born from one of the most heated factional rivalries of the Attitude Era. The Rock. The Rock, born Dwayne Johnson, would go on to become one of the biggest stars not just in professional wrestling history, but in all of entertainment. But in 1997, Rocky Maivia, as he was then known, was still finding his footing in the WWF, leading a faction called the Nation of Domination. When his path crossed with Owen Hart and the reformed Hart Foundation, the resulting conflict would incorporate elements that went far beyond typical wrestling storylines. The rivalry between the Hart Foundation and the Nation of Domination in 1997 was built around a Canada versus USA storyline that capitalized on the real anti-American sentiment that Canadian wrestling fans were feeling at the time. As documented by wrestling historians, this angle incorporated real national tensions and even touched on racial dynamics in ways that made for compelling but also complicated television. Owen, as a key member of the Hart Foundation, was directly involved in this heated feud. The Nation of Domination was a faction that addressed themes of racial identity and empowerment, while the Hart Foundation played on Canadian national pride and resentment toward American cultural dominance. When these two groups clashed, the promos became intensely personal. The Rock, in his role as faction leader, targeted Owen's family legacy in his promos, adding a genuine competitive edge to their televised confrontations. Reports from this era suggest that the intensity of the storyline led to heated backstage discussions about where the lines were being drawn. Both performers were committed to making the feud feel real, and that commitment sometimes created friction as they negotiated what was appropriate for their characters to say and do. The national and factional tensions that played out on screen were amplified by genuine competitive dislike that developed as both men fought for their positions in the company. If you enjoyed this video, please click on any of the cards on your screen.